Max Verstappen may have just told us something huge about his future without ever saying it out loud, because the weekend that made Formula One fans ask the biggest questions about Max did not happen in a Red Bull. It happened in a Mercedes GT3 at the Nürburgring. And that is exactly why this story feels strange the second you look at it. For most fans, Max is not just another driver on the grid. He is Red Bull, he is the face of an era. He is the guy who turned pure aggression, control, and confidence into a championship blueprint. So when that same driver shows up in a Mercedes AMG GT3 and somehow looks completely at home doing it, your brain immediately starts trying to solve a puzzle. Is this just a fun side project? Is it a headline people are overreacting to? Or is this one of those moments that only looks small until later, when everybody realizes it was actually the beginning of a much bigger shift? That is the real question here, not whether Max drove a Mercedes, not whether fans like the photos, not whether it looked cool. The real question is why this particular weekend made so many people feel the same thing at once. Curiosity, yes, but also a strange kind of unease. Like they were watching a clue, not a cameo. And by the end of this video, that is what we are going to figure out. Because the real reason fans are asking bigger questions has very little to do with the badge on the front of the car. It has much more to do with what Max seems to be searching for when he goes racing. If you're a casual Formula One fan, here is the short version. Max Verstappen is not just fast, he is one of the defining drivers of the modern era. He is a multiple time world champion. He is the center of gravity in almost any room he walks into inside the paddock. So when someone like that starts investing energy, time, and emotion into racing outside Formula One, people notice. They notice because stars do not move by accident, and they really do not move by accident when they have already reached the top. That is why this Nürburgring story hit so differently, because it did not feel like a marketing day. It did not feel like a sponsor obligation. It did not even feel like one of those celebrity racing stories that gets attention for a weekend and disappears. It felt more serious than that, more deliberate, more personal. And the second you feel that, the next question becomes unavoidable. What does Max know about his own future that the rest of Formula One is only starting to sense? Now, to understand why this Mercedes GT3 run made people nervous and excited at the same time, you have to understand something important. This was not just Max messing around in another car because he likes driving anything with wheels. This was a real endurance racing program, a real preparation step, a real target. He confirmed he is doing the Nürburgring 24 hours in a Mercedes AMG GT3 under the Verstappen Racing and Windward banner. That matters, because the Nürburgring 24 is not some light exhibition event where a Formula One star drops in, take pictures, and leaves with a smile. It is one of the wildest tests in motorsport, long, brutal, chaotic, technical, unpredictable. You do not slide into that world casually if you are Max Verstappen and your actual day job is still Formula One. And that is where the stakes start getting bigger. Because if this were only about fun, it would still be interesting. But it would not be important. What makes it important is the timing. Max has been openly critical of the direction Formula One is heading with the 2026 rules. He has talked about how the cars risk becoming too dependent on electrical deployment, too managed, too artificial, too far removed from what drivers instinctively love about racing. That matters because drivers say things all the time. Most of it disappears into the paddock air by the next race weekend, but with Max, words land differently. They land differently because he does not sound like a guy playing a political game. He sounds like a guy measuring whether the sport still gives him what he wants. So now put those two things next to each other. On one side, you have a champion who sounds increasingly uneasy about where Formula One is going. On the other side, you have that same champion stepping deeper into endurance racing, not as a tourist, but as someone genuinely preparing for one of the most demanding events in the world. That is not nothing, that is a pattern, and fans can feel it even if they cannot fully explain it yet. Then there's the Red Bull angle, which makes this even more revealing. If the people around Max saw this as a silly distraction, they would not treat it the way they have. But the signal coming from Red Bull has been the opposite. They understand this is real. They understand he lights up when he talks about racing in places like this. That tells you something powerful. It tells you the people closest to him do not see GT3 and endurance racing as random hobbies. They see them as part of who he is. And honestly, that is what makes this story emotional, not just strategic. Because underneath all the speculation, this may simply be about a champion trying to protect the purest part of himself. The part that loved racing before the brand, before the politics, before the endless media cycle, before every weekend became a referendum on history. The part that still wants to be tested in a raw, difficult, slightly dangerous environment where instinct matters and comfort disappears. That version of Max makes sense to people. Even people who are not hardcore fans can feel it. There's something deeply relatable about someone reaching the top of one world, then quietly looking around and asking, is this still the version of the dream I actually wanted? And once you see the story that way, the Mercedes badge almost becomes a distraction. The badge is the bait, the real story is the hunger underneath it. That is why this is not just a weird image from an unusual weekend. It is why so many fans instantly felt there was something bigger hiding underneath. Not because they think Max is about to walk away tomorrow, not because they think one GT3 drive changes everything, but because they recognize a certain kind of energy when they see it, the energy of someone who does not just want to compete, the energy of someone trying to find the place where racing still feels fully alive. And if that is what you are seeing too, tell me where you think this goes next. Because the next layer of this story is where it gets a lot harder to dismiss as just a cool side mission. Because once you look at what actually happened on that weekend, the mystery stops feeling smaller and starts getting a lot bigger. This is where the story starts getting dangerous in the most interesting way. Because if you strip away the headline, strip away the photos, strip away the easy reaction of Max Verstappen in a Mercedes, what you're left with is something much harder to explain away. You're left with a performance, a serious one, the kind that instantly changes the tone of the conversation. At first, the image is what grabs people. Of course it does. Max Verstappen is supposed to look natural in a Red Bull. He is supposed to look like the center of the Red Bull universe. So when fans see him climbing into a Mercedes AMG GT3, there's a split second where the whole thing feels almost wrong. Familiar driver, wrong uniform, that alone creates tension. But image based tension fades quickly. What keeps a story alive is substance. And the second you look at what actually happened on track, this stops being a funny crossover and starts looking like something much more real. Because Max did not show up at NLS2 to wave at a crowd and disappear. He showed up ready to compete, ready to learn, ready to win. That matters. The car was fast immediately. Not just respectable, not just decent for a Formula One guy doing something different. Fast enough to make serious people pay attention. The sort of pace that tells you this was not a publicity exercise with a famous name attached to it. This was a proper racing effort with a proper racing standard. And then the numbers started stacking up. The car took pole by nearly 2 seconds. In motorsport, 2 seconds can feel like another planet. That is not a cute margin. That is not a celebrity cameo margin. That is a statement, and it immediately creates the first uncomfortable question. If this was just Max having fun, why did it look this prepared? Then came the race itself. The car did not just hang around. It controlled the event. It crossed the line first by 59 seconds. 59, not a photo finish, not a lucky call. Nearly a full minute. That is domination in any language. Then the disqualification hit. 7 sets of tires instead of 6. Technical, procedural, frustrating. Suddenly the headline changed. Suddenly the result got messy. Suddenly people had a reason to reduce the entire weekend to a weird footnote. But that actually made the mystery stronger, not weaker. Because if the whole point of the weekend was a win, then maybe the disqualification would have punctured the story. Maybe it would have turned the whole thing into an awkward, almost moment. But that is not how Max sounded. He did not sound crushed. He did not sound like someone whose weekend had lost its meaning. He sounded like someone who still believed the weekend had been valuable. And that is the second uncomfortable question. If the trophy disappeared, but the satisfaction did not, what exactly was Max getting out of this? It gets even more interesting when you zoom in further. The car completed 29 laps on a brutal 24.358-kilometer layout. That is a huge amount of real racing on one of the most unforgiving places in motorsport. The analysis afterward also suggested Max was responsible for 6 of the car fastest laps. Not one flashy moment, not one heroic lap for social media. 6, that is how you know this was not about attention. Attention does not produce 6 fastest laps in an environment like that. Focus does, craft does, obsession does. So now the story starts turning on itself because every time you try to shrink it back down, the details refuse to cooperate. If this was just a fun weekend, why was the preparation level so serious? If this was just a marketing story, why was the pace real enough to force GT3 people to take him seriously? If the win on paper vanished, why did the experience still seem to matter so much to him? And the deeper you go, the stranger it gets. Because Formula One fans are trained to interpret everything through contracts, teams, politics, and future seats. That is the language of the sport now. A driver smiles next to the wrong team principal, and the internet turns it into a transfer rumor. A driver praises another category, and people assume he is planning an exit. So when Max appears in a Mercedes, the default reaction is obvious. This must be about Mercedes. This must be about Formula One. This must be about some hidden move nobody's ready to say out loud. But the weekend itself keeps pushing back on that interpretation. It keeps suggesting something less simple and more revealing, something more personal. Because the more you study what happened, the less it looks like Max stepping away from himself. And the more it looks like Max stepping toward a part of himself that Formula One does not always fully use anymore. That is the real drop here. The scary possibility for Formula One is not that Max suddenly wants a different employer. The scary possibility is that he may be finding a different kind of joy, and those are not the same thing at all. A different employer still keeps the ecosystem intact. It means the story stays inside Formula One. Same cameras, same grid, same game, different colors, but a different kind of joy that is more disruptive. Because that means the question is no longer where Max wants to race. It becomes what kind of racing still makes him feel most alive. And if you are Formula One, that is a much harder question to hear. Because maybe fans have been looking at the wrong word this entire time. Maybe the word is not Mercedes. Maybe the word is not future. Maybe the word is not even departure. Maybe the word is authenticity. That is the assumption the story forces you to flip. Most people saw the badge and assumed the drama was about brands, but the deeper drama may be about identity, about the kind of driver Max is when all the noise falls away. Think about the difference. Formula One right now can sometimes feel like a boardroom with carbon fiber on it. Endless regulation fights, political subtext, technical direction debates, power unit arguments, public messaging, narrative management. Every opinion becomes a mini battle. Every weekend carries the weight of history. Nürburgring feels different. It feels like a test. A real one. Traffic everywhere, changing grip, shared danger, teamwork that actually matters, long stints, no easy rhythm, no sterile perfection. You do not get to fake your way through a place like that. You either adapt or the track exposes you. That is why the twist matters so much. The point of this weekend was never just that Max drove a Mercedes. The point is that he looked deeply, almost disturbingly comfortable in a world that offers something Formula the first of maybe offering him less of. Raw challenge, variety, problem solving, racing that feels less curated and more elemental. And once you see it that way, everything changes. The photos change, the headlines change, even the fan reaction changes. Because now the big question is no longer, is Max secretly talking to Mercedes for Formula One? The bigger question is, does Max still see Formula One as the only place where his racing life can feel complete? That is a much bigger question, and honestly, it is a more interesting one too, because it forces you to separate career strategy from personal truth. It forces you to consider the possibility that the most important thing Max showed us at Nürburgring was not ambition. It was recognition, recognition of the environment where his instincts feel cleanest. Formula One is where Max became an icon, but what if places like Nürburgring are where Max feels most like a racer? That is not a small difference. That is the whole story. And if you're still here, I want your take on this because this is where the conversation gets really good. Do you think this is mainly about a future contract? Or do you think it is about Max trying to protect the purest version of what racing feels like for him? Put that in the comments because the answer to that changes how you read everything that comes next. Now, here's why this twist lands so hard. If this were just a poetic way of looking at one unusual weekend, it would not hold up for long. It would sound nice, but it would collapse under real evidence. The problem for everyone trying to dismiss it is that the evidence keeps lining up in the same direction. The people around Max do not treat this like a random hobby. The calendar does not treat it like a random hobby. The drivers inside that GT3 world definitely do not treat it like a random hobby. And that is when the story becomes impossible to reduce back to a simple headline. Because once a champion starts showing you where his eyes light up, you have to pay attention, especially when that light seems to appear in places outside the center of Formula One. So, yes, the Mercedes badge got your attention. That part was easy. But the much more important thing is what the weekend revealed underneath it: a driver who did not look distracted, a driver who did not look like he was escaping, a driver who looked maybe more than anything aligned. And if that sounds dramatic, the next part is where the case gets a lot stronger because the proof is not hiding in theory. It is hiding in what Max said, what Red Bull allowed, and what real GT3 people noticed almost immediately. So let us test the twist against real evidence, because if this whole idea is true, if this really is about Max Verstappen finding a version of racing that feels more real to him, then you should be able to see it in three places. You should hear it from the people around him. You should see it in what he chooses to do next. And you should feel it in the way actual GT3 drivers talk about him once the cameras calm down. And somehow, all three of those things point in the same direction. Start with Red Bull. If this were a random hobby, the people closest to Max would treat it like one. They would smile, call it fun, maybe frame it as a nice side story, and keep the focus on Formula One. But that is not the tone that has come out of this. The tone has been much more revealing than that. Laurent Mekies basically made the core point clear. Max did not need to sell anyone on this. He did not need to convince the team. The reaction inside Red Bull was not, "Why are you doing this?" It was, "We know exactly why you're doing this." Because when Max talks about race cars, when he talks about projects like this, people around him can see the difference instantly. The energy changes, the eyes light up. That detail matters more than it sounds like it does. Because teams see drivers in every mood. They see the media version, the political version, the exhausted version, the version that knows exactly what to say into a microphone. So when people inside that world notice that a driver comes alive in a different way around a certain kind of racing, you should take that seriously. That is not branding. That is not narrative spin. That is recognition. And it gets stronger when you look at what Max did next. He did not treat NLS2 like a one weekend curiosity and move on. He confirmed more preparation for the Nürburgring 24. He committed to the qualifiers on April 18th and 19. He talked about wanting more experience in the dark, more experience in the wet. In other words, he was not done. He was not satisfied by simply showing up once and proving he could be quick. He wanted more layers of the challenge. That is a huge tell, because curiosity wants a taste. Commitment wants the full environment. Commitment wants the uncomfortable version. Commitment wants the variables that make the whole thing harder. And that is exactly what Max sounded like. Not someone who had checked a box, someone who had found something worth going deeper into. Then there's the part that may be the most revealing of all, the way actual GT3 people reacted. This matters because celebrity can fool casual fans for a weekend, but it does not fool specialists. People inside a category know the difference between famous and dangerous. They know the difference between talented and adapted. They know when someone is visiting, and they know when someone is truly reading the language of the car. And one of the strongest little clues came from Danny Juncadella. He described Max finding a trick for dealing with dirty air, something that caught even experienced GT3 people off guard. Now stop on that for a second, because that is the kind of detail most casual viewers would miss. But it is exactly the kind of detail that tells you who someone really is as a racer. Anybody can post a good lap. Very few people walk into a category with its own habits, its own instincts, its own rhythm, and immediately begin solving problems inside that category at a level that impresses the people who live there. That is not fame, that is craft. And that is why the proof here feels so strong. The story is not that Max is talented, everybody already knew that. The story is that he seems to absorb this world very quickly, and maybe more importantly, enjoy absorbing it. That second part is everything, because the more you listen to the evidence, the less this feels like a driver escaping Formula One. It feels like a driver rediscovering something that Formula One does not always give him in the same way anymore. There's also the raw performance layer, which should not get lost behind the disqualification headline. The post-race analysis made that point pretty clearly. The technical violation became the news, but it also covered up just how serious the pace had been. The number 3 Mercedes was not surviving on celebrity energy. It was operating at a very high level, and Max was a huge part of that. That is the kind of thing serious racing people notice right away. They do not care that he is famous. They care that the car was genuinely fast. They care that the pace repeated. They care that the inputs looked clean. They care that the adaptation curve looked sharp. That is what earns respect in a paddock like that. So when you put all of it together, the picture becomes very hard to ignore. Red Bull sees this as something deeply real for Max. Max himself is committing more time, more preparation, and more discomfort to it. GT3 people are reacting not to the name, but to the level. That is not a random triangle, that is a pattern. And once you see that pattern, the original question from the start of the video finally becomes easier to answer. Fans were not shocked because Max sat in a Mercedes. Fans were shocked because for one weekend, maybe more clearly than ever, Max seemed to reveal what kind of racing still makes him feel completely switched on. That is the real reason the questions got bigger. Because this story was never about a logo, it was about recognition. Recognition of the environment where Max looks most engaged, most curious, most alive. And now the payoff becomes very simple. The Mercedes GT3 run mattered because it showed fans something Formula One alone has not shown this clearly in a while. It showed Max Verstappen in a racing context that felt pure, difficult, technical, and strangely personal. It showed him not just competing, but leaning in. And when a driver at his level leans in that hard outside his main arena, people are going to ask what that means. Now, to be clear, this is not proof that Max is about to leave Formula One. It is not proof that he is already planning an exit date. And it is definitely not proof that one endurance weekend matters more than everything he has built in F1. But it is proof of something important. It is proof that Max is building a racing life bigger than Formula One. That matters because the future does not always begin with a dramatic announcement. Sometimes it begins with a pattern of choices, one event, one commitment, one extra preparation race. One comment about wanting more rain running, more night running, more real experience. The future often arrives like that, quietly, then all at once. And that is why this should matter to Formula One too. Because if one of the greatest drivers on the planet starts finding the purest version of racing somewhere else, that is not just a Max story. That is a question about the sport itself, about what it rewards, about what it has become, about whether the best drivers still feel the deepest joy in the center of the system or increasingly at the edges of it. That is a hard question, and F1 may not like the answer if this trend keeps growing. Maybe Nürburgring ends up being just one chapter. Maybe it becomes something bigger. Maybe years from now, people look back at these GT3 weekends as the first visible signs of a different second act for Max Verstappen. Not a lesser one, not a slower one, just a different one. One built around the kind of racing that strips everything back down to instinct, adaptation, and nerve. And honestly, that feels possible now in a way it did not before. So the next time you see a picture of Max in that Mercedes GT3, do not ask the smallest question. Do not ask why is he in that car. Ask the bigger one. Ask what that car seems to unlock in him. Because that is the question that actually matters. And if you want the next part of that answer, stay with this channel because the next few weeks may tell us whether this was just a fascinating detour or the first real trailer for the version of Max Verstappen that comes after the center of Formula One. Because if Nürburgring was not just a weekend, then the next clue is probably already on the way.